And what we are talking about is, of course, homegrown domestic terrorism, right-wing terrorism. That's what many of these Congress people and lawmakers are concerned about. The threat of domestic terrorism and violence against lawmakers and government buildings in the U.S. has sparked new concerns over the rise of far-right extremism across the country. So much so, as we told you, that bipartisan lawmakers are now requesting more security following the deadly Capitol assault on January 6th. CBS News has learned that they have sent congressional leaders a letter saying that they are targets and asking to use their allowances for more protection when traveling home. This comes as the Department of Homeland Security issues a new alert warning of potential violence against elected officials in the future. So, for more on this, we want to bring in Elizabeth Neumann. She is the co-director of the Republican Accountability Project and has also worked in the Department of Homeland Security. So you're the best person to talk about this. Elizabeth, why is this new bulletin so concerning, and what does it say about the rise of right-wing extremism in this country?
Really, the bulletin is just catching up with the actual threat. We have been facing this rise of right-wing violent extremism for the last 10 years. It was not fully understood or detected appropriately until about 2 years ago. But I think there's an argument to be made that we really should have had this bulletin issued maybe sometime late last spring or early summer when we had indications that we had groups like the Boogaloo Boys infiltrate the George Floyd protests and kill law enforcement officers. We had the militia plot to kidnap governors that became public in October. It was very clear that some of these strains of right-wing violent extremism that have been with us for quite some time were starting to mobilize to violence, and arguably the Department of Homeland Security, which has this statutory responsibility to warn the public through these bulletins, arguably they should have done it at the latest last summer. And then when you move into this December time period where there were very specific chatter online about potential violence on January 6th, arguably they should have done it then. On the other side of January 6th, it is my understanding that they did draft a bulletin and that the leaders at the Department of Homeland Security wanted to issue it, but the former White House stopped it. So what I think you see here is the department catching up with what should have been issued months ago. As the threat environment had changed, we were increasingly concerned about attacks coming from these right-wing violent extremist groups. And certainly what happened on January 6th has had a rallying cry effect, and we're likely to see more violence in the coming months, sadly.
So, Elizabeth, let me ask you a question about Republican sentiment with regards to what we saw happen on January 6th. There are a number of Republicans who are saying, for example, when it comes to the impeachment of President Trump, that we should move on. I saw Nikki Haley on television this week, saying, hasn't Trump been through enough? We should just move on. Other Republicans are saying, President Biden keeps talking about unity. This is not unity in trying to relitigate or to rehash what happened on January 6th. But I'm curious if you've spoken to some of your Republican colleagues about, for example, there are a lot of people who are wondering, so we had hearing after hearing after hearing after Benghazi, the attack in Benghazi that happened in 2012. I don't want to sound naive and just think to myself, well, all those hearings, all those investigations, the dollars that were spent investigating, the time that was spent holding those hearings was all political in nature, that in fact, some of these lawmakers didn't really care about what happened in Benghazi. It was just a way to attack Secretary Clinton and the Obama administration. Wouldn't you guess that, when something like that happens right here in America, at the United States Capitol, that you would want the same level of investigation? It's only been a couple of weeks. We're talking about in Benghazi, it was, months and years after that we were still investigating. Are you hearing that they can't, that there's a disconnect for a lot of Americans watching what some of them are saying?
There's absolutely a disconnect. The Republican Party, the bulk majority of them, have shown that they're morally bankrupt. There is no consistency of their principles. They lack the character to stand up against what they might be fearing would be criticism from Trump. I mean, he doesn't even have a Twitter account anymore, but they're still scared of his shadow. It's shocking to me, and I think it's actually a political miscalculation. I think they're looking at polls of a relatively small number, but a very vocal minority of the Republican Party that are exacerbating this idea that they have been targeted, that the left and the mainstream media are coming out to get them, and they are very vocal, and they have been vocal for the last 4 years under Trump. But I think there are a lot more Americans that would respond, and by Americans, a lot more Republicans that would respond to people of principle and of character to say, if they were to come out and say, what happened on January 6th can never happen again. And we need to be introspective. How did we get to that point? One of the ways we got to that point is you were lied to. And I or my colleagues participated in that lie, and I am sorry. Now, look, that takes a lot of character, and it takes a lot of courage to admit if you were a part of the problem. But that's really the moment that we're in. We need Republicans, not for the sake of their party, not even for the sake of their political future, although that seems to be all they care about. We really need them to come and debunk these lies that have led individuals to believe that the only answer they have is violence. I was reading open source intelligence again today where people are posting that they have no ability to use the political process to achieve their means, that the whole thing is a scam and it's controlled by leftists because Trump legitimately won the election, but it was stolen from him. Therefore, violence is our only answer. So this narrative still exists. This narrative will continue to exist until a preponderance of Republicans, it can't be voices outside, it has to come from within the community. They have to tell the American people the truth, that the election was not stolen, that Donald Trump was making all of that up, that there wasn't a significant enough fraud to have overturned the results. And then it would be great if they would go so far to uncover other false narratives that the president has laid, things about COVID, to be able to begin to help people understand that they were deceived for quite some time by this president and by the echo chamber that the conservative media operates in. And look, that's a hard thing to come out and say, I participated in this process, in this lie. But for the sake of your honor, for the sake of being able to look at your grandkids in the eye, for the sake of security of this country, that is what is needed right now. We need Republicans to stand up and do the right thing. And that's why I joined the Republican Accountability Project. Right now, sadly, there appear to be 15 Republicans with any sort of integrity in Congress, and so be it. If that's what we got, we are going to defend them from primary challenges. Donald Trump's already threatened them to come after them in their next election. We are going to defend them. And then we're also going to go to those members of Congress in the Republican Party that are the most involved in spreading these lies and the seditious part of leading up to January 6th. We are going to make sure their constituents know that their representative, their senator, was complicit in what happened on January 6th. And hopefully their constituents will hold their representatives accountable for that. So that's what the Accountability Project's about. These people seem to only understand politics. Okay, fine. We'll raise the money and we'll play the politics game to hold them accountable, because our security, the security of our country is worth it. Fighting for the heart and soul of our country is worth it. And right now we have way too many Americans that have been lied to. They deserve to know the truth.
Elizabeth, you said, it's time for the Republican Party to stand up and do the right thing. What is the right thing to do with Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene? You know the sort of latest reports on her social media history that supports violence against other Democrats, harassing a victim of a student of a school shooting. And Nancy Pelosi was just asked about that, and she said she was more angry at the Republican leadership for rewarding her with a position on a committee. The flip side is her constituents in Georgia elected her. They knew what she was about. She didn't shy away from her, her QAnon theory endorsement. So, you know, what do you do with a congresswoman like this who has been voted into office, who is, you know, supporting and espousing some of the very things that you say concern you incredibly about, you know, what's happening with the Republican Party?
So I think it's really important that the action that the Republican Party doesn't play into the hands of the deception machine that exists on the right. Even as we talk about domestic terrorism, you have commentators in conservative media who are claiming that that the rest of us, like the liberal media, counterterrorism experts, are calling 74 million Americans that voted for Trump domestic terrorists. That's not true. Nobody, to my knowledge, has said that, but they make up these lies. They insert it into their conservative echo chamber, and it becomes their reality, and it's increasing the divide between us. So when dealing with a person like Marjorie Taylor Greene, it needs to be done carefully, but at a minimum, she should not have a committee assignment. And then I think there is a case to be made that if she participated in sedition in the lead up to January 6th, if the investigation shows that she contributed in some way, the 14th Amendment says that she should be expelled from Congress. So that's a simple majority vote that would be needed. And hypothetically, with the Democrats controlling both houses, they could take that action if the investigation shows that cause. I mean, look, from a personal perspective, the Republican Party that I thought I grew up with would have never allowed her to caucus with them to begin with, would have spoken out during the primary season and during the general election to show that she was ostracized. Clearly, they lack the backbone to do that, but they should recognize we're at a turning point here. I know that Donald Trump, that's the way that he acted, and she's just a product of the Trump effect, but we are at a moment of time where we can turn the table. We do not have to continue to be the party of Trump. We do not have to continue to carry on with his approach, which is lies and hateful rhetoric that has led to an increase in hate crimes, that can be statistically shown that his rhetoric leads to that. You don't have to choose to be the party of hate anymore. You could turn your back on that, and there are several ways that they could do that, and they should do it carefully. We don't want to create a precedent whereby just because you hold a viewpoint that is not popular opinion that you're ostracized. But I think when you advocate for violence and you use language that is as hateful as she has used, you do not deserve a position of public trust. You violated your oath of office. And eventually, I hope they find a way to remove her from her position.
Elizabeth, let me also ask you about this. As you know, Congressman Matt Gaetz is traveling to Wyoming today to hold a major event at the state capitol. Let's just remind our viewers, he's from Florida, not from Wyoming. He's expected to slam fellow Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney on her home turf for voting to impeach former President Trump earlier this month. I think it was Ronald Reagan, Elizabeth, who had this quote, and maybe I'm paraphrasing it, thou shalt not, go after the party, or, thou shalt always be a Republican. I think, and we've seen a little, maybe you remember the quote. I'm sort of pulling out of the dusty reaches of my mind, but and we've seen a little bit of that, of people that are still around from the Reagan administration, folks like Jim Baker, even Dick Cheney, and former President George W. Bush. Like, you haven't seen them really forcefully criticizing President Trump. You haven't really seen them forcefully criticizing some of the people who have taken positions that seem, frankly, not typical of a Republican position, for example, with regards to the deficit. So because they, I think, believe still in that old Reagan mantra. And yet here you've got a Republican who's going to the home state, of another Congresswoman, just because she decided to do something, she decided to vote her conscience. And in my mind, I think to myself, Liz Cheney is as Republican as they come. I just don't understand, so help us understand what it means to be a Republican now. I mean, who is a Republican and who isn't? Because if being a Republican is only fealty to Donald Trump, that would strike me as sort of strange. But it does seem that that's what you're seeing from a lot of these members of Congress, this coalescing around just a cult of personality.
Look, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And so with Trump's absence, there is this various factions within the Republican Party that are fighting to take back the reins, if you will, and they're posturing for their 2022 and 2024 elections, and they're looking to figure out what's the best way to capitalize on what Trump has built. I personally think that is a failed strategy, but what Matt Gaetz is doing is clearly has nothing to do with principle and everything to do with trying to make a name for himself. He's trying to raise funding off of this, and if that's your goal, like, it's actually not a bad strategy. It's sensational. You and I are talking about it, but does that mean that you're actually casting a vision for what the future is, or legitimately working on the principles of what the party should stand for? No, like they are just taking a page out of Donald Trump's playbook, which is you constantly want to generate media buzz. There is no such thing as bad press, because as long as you're in the news and you're taking up the airtime, the conversation is all about you, you're winning. I want to think that the Republican Party, most Americans in this country, most of the 74 million that voted for Trump were holding their nose and voting for him. They didn't like his character. They didn't like all of the drama. They didn't like, the everything constantly being about him. And they were voting for policy reasons as opposed to the like of Trump. In fact, when you look at the statistics of who is like a diehard Trump supporter, it's a very small minority. It varies between polls, but one poll had it at 17% of Republicans are Trumpian, like that diehard. They want the party to be about Trump. Well, 17% is not very large. That's a sizable portion of the Republican Party that would be open to other arguments and open to other perspectives. So I think we're going to see an active civil war within the party of trying to define what the party is and what its principles are. It's really hard to do, and they've been principle-less for at least 4 years. Some would argue longer. And there are also active conversations underway of whether to start a third party, whether you just kind of turn the Trumpian world over to Trump and wash our hands of the Republican Party and start something new. I believe that it's important to have a strong, principled center-right party. And what Trumpism stands for is authoritarianism. It stands for, sadly, increasingly racism and xenophobia. And that really cannot be tolerated in a two-party system where that second party gets a lot of funding under our current structures and a lot of attention based on the current laws. It's not right for the second of those two parties to be about something that's so anti-American. Authoritarianism, that's what we rejected, and that is increasingly where you see Trumpism leading people. So it's good that there are people willing to fight for the Republican Party, and I think it's also good for the first time in a while you're seeing people say, this might be the time for us to start a third party, because we cannot tolerate a Republican Party that embraces Trumpism any longer.
My producer Ross reminded me that the 11th commandment of Ronald Reagan, Elizabeth, which he gave during his campaign for governor in 1966, was thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican.
That's right. I do remember that.
Yeah, that's very clearly gone out the window, at least if you're Matt Gaetz. So here we are in 2021. Elizabeth Neumann, always great to have your perspective, Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.